talking a lot about cloud and applications and all kinds of things. So now I think we'll start addressing more on the bits and bytes of the whole infrastructure aspect of it. And the best person to talk to is someone who has gone through a journey with a very, very illustrious career at Cisco, building networking, compute, storage products, and then into Broadcom, which is the crux of, semiconductor, which is the crux of all the underlying technologies, and he helped to scale the revenues at Broadcom pretty significantly. And now, at VMware, which is the pioneer in this whole software-defined data center concept, which he just joined about a month ago or so. So Rajiv, welcome. We're very honored and privileged to have you here. Thank you so much for participating in this panel. Why don't you share with us your journey of your career of Cisco, Broadcom, and now the excitement that you're seeing at VMware, and what really excited you to be part of this at this phase of VMware?
Thanks, Jagdish. The interesting thing is we've known each other for a long time.
That's
back
true.
from those days all the way along. I'm glad to be here at TiEcon. The irony is TiEcon has been going on for a number of years. This is actually my first time.
Oh, wow, really?
Coming here.
It's 24 years.
Yes, so I've never been here, but I'm glad to be here. So in terms of my journey, starting with, it's always been about networking in some form, shape, or the other. And I spent many years at Cisco, kind of in the heydays, and networking, Cisco obviously has a very, very big business in networking, starting with traditional LAN switching and routing, and then eventually, moving into data center. And I remember back in the day, we were always looking at where else could we be extending the network, and where else could we be extending Ethernet? And it became more and more pervasive, and obviously became the backbone of Cisco's business. And today, it continues to remain the backbone of Cisco's business. Back in the day, networking, and is for the most part, still continues to be a vertically integrated business, right? So if you look at the food chain, there's people who build chips, there's people who put boxes together, and then operating system software, and then you go sell the whole thing together and service it. And Cisco would do everything, and they still do everything today. What's happening kind of over the last 7, 8 years is that there's been a slow but steady disaggregation of this whole networking stack. Mm-hmm. Much like what's happened in servers and in PCs, for example. Mm-hmm. So you have merchant silicon folks coming in, and Broadcom was a key player. In fact, in the late 2000s, it was becoming very clear that merchant silicon players like Broadcom were able to bring out products that would significantly advance the state of the art, and not easy for in-house folks to continue that level of development. Just because it's a capital-intensive thing, building chips, and you need a whole process, methodology, and execution plan to continue doing it. So I saw that change and that transition at Broadcom, over the last many years, combined with the growth in data center, both private and public cloud data centers, and this whole kind of need to scale the network, right, which was increasingly getting in the way. When you build campus networks, it was all about, hey, your desktop users connecting into client-server applications. In data centers, you have thousands and thousands of servers all talking to each other, right, with massive amounts of traffic that require just different scales of networking. And so that transition was enabled by Broadcom and by building the chips, and also started the disaggregation process. So now you could have folks like Arista come out there and build an entire company around building boxes and software based on merchant silicon products. And now the next kind of phase is software networking. There was a lot of hype about SDN and software-defined networking, and I like to think about one specific use case as network virtualization. So you have the physical layer, you have chips, and you have boxes, and you have an operating system software, which provided by a variety of people. And then you have the virtual networking layer, which is a completely new layer, because most data centers are virtualized, whether it's public or a private cloud. And you can do a lot of things in virtualization that you cannot do in the physical layer, right? You can automate how data centers get deployed. Think about automating IT overall. And you can figure out how to increase the utilization of the resources you have. If you look at a software-defined data center, you still have pools of resources that get standard, right? First generation was server virtualization, which VMware drove, and that increased the utilization of your servers and helped quite a bit. But even with all that, people would deploy silos. And if you take network virtualization, you add that on to server virtualization, then now you have the ability to really run any workload anywhere without standard resources. And that helps you up the utilization of data centers. It helps you also automate how data centers get deployed. Along with that, you get new capabilities, like, for example, the ability to provide security at a different level that you could not do otherwise. Imagine today, there's a ton of traffic within data centers. There's a lot more traffic inside data centers by orders of magnitude compared to what goes in and out. Now, most people, the way they treat security today is it's perimeter security, which is security is always at the perimeter. You try to prevent people from coming in. The problem is once people come in and they break that one way or the other, sometimes it might be a trusted inside guy, okay, then everything inside is completely unprotected.
Is that the micro-segmentation?
That is micro-segmentation. So how do you protect that traffic? And it's very difficult to do that in a traditional way. And the best way to do that is actually at the source of the traffic, which is now at the VM, right, at the application of the VM, and enforcing policies and enforcing least privilege there and stopping stuff there is really the only way to protect it. So all of these are functions enabled by network virtualization. Then you have context. You know what people are doing. Again, that's something that physical network guys is very hard to do. So you can do context-based security. So all of these are changing, and this is really why I think network virtualization is growing in adoption tremendously. I mean, and that's being seen in terms of how our business is performing as a result of that. And it's got a long ways to go still.
Yeah. So in the morning, right, we've been talking a lot about this whole public cloud, private cloud, hyper cloud, and all that stuff, right? So why is this network virtualization, this is the right time, you think, today, as compared to several years ago or several years from now? Why do you think this is the right time?
So the first thing that needed to happen was server virtualization, right? You can't really have network virtualization without virtualizing the compute layer, which is now well established, whether it's public or private cloud. The second thing is now you're starting to see these use cases come about, right? People want to automate the entire data center and get to a new level of security. The third reason is exactly what you said, which is this mixed hybrid cloud, right? So many people have private clouds, and there's increasing use of the public cloud. And that's a phenomenon that's going to continue for many, many years. And there's going to be a mixed environment. There'll be some people who are entirely on the public cloud. The majority of the large enterprises are on private cloud, but moving over time slowly to public cloud. So the question is, how do you manage that? How do you handle that migration? And you can see there is a real danger for IT folks losing control in this process. So what happens typically is that you have your IT shop, and then you have lines of businesses, and app developers in large enterprises who decide they can actually get things done faster in the public cloud. They go out there, they go to Amazon or Azure and go spin up and do workloads. IT is left out of the equation. Soon enough, it starts getting pretty serious, and now it's, the IT guy doesn't know how to control it anymore. You call it shadow IT. And so part of the value add here, therefore, for network virtualization is, first of all, allows you to move and migrate workloads from one to the other. It allows you to become a control and management plane and provide security for workloads, whether you're in the public cloud or in the private cloud. And it basically allows IT to remain relevant in this whole transition from private to public cloud.
I see. I mean, I think VMware made the first move in acquiring Nicira, right, which is one of the fundamental steps of defining this whole network virtualization. How much of this technology, which is very early stage, right, at the time when you guys acquired, how much of that has evolved, and what more needs to be done in that space?
Yeah. So as with any technology, initially there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of vision. And I would be the first to say that initially, network vision, virtualization had a grand vision. To some extent, it was a solution looking for a problem. And then over time, use cases came on.
It's common in Silicon Valley, right?
Yeah, and that's the way a lot of new things get created anyway, right? So, but over time, as the use cases became clear, that really led to the technology going beyond what I would call an incubation phase to now scale and deployment. And where we're at today with it is, you have hundreds of enterprises in production with it. It's well beyond an incubation phase, and now it's in the scale or transformation phase where you're really deploying. And network virtualization, in my view, could be as big a business as server virtualization is. And even bigger because I think it kind of bridges this whole gap between private and public clouds. So long ways to go still. Probably in the second innings at this point, beyond the first innings.
What do you see in this whole proliferation of public cloud and the private cloud, right? Do you see like early adoption of enterprises using both the public cloud, I mean, building your own private cloud, and then moving into the public clouds? And especially, there is so much of noise about and also mind share in the public cloud with AWS, with Google and other guys, right? What is your stand on this, and what's your thought process on this?
So, in fact, I just came from 2 weeks of meeting a whole range of customers, I would say. So I have a sampling of a wide variety of enterprise customers. And I can say that they're all in different phases in their evolution. Depending on who you talk to, you will see kind of a range. On the one hand, you have folks who are pretty happy with their private cloud. They're concerned about security in the public cloud. They're very reluctant to move. They're fairly conservative. And they'll probably remain that way for a while to come. Mm-hmm. And many large financial institutions probably would fall into that category. Mm-hmm. And many of them are focused on building the most efficient private cloud that there is. And what may not be well apparent is that if somebody were to take the pains to build an efficient private cloud, that could be actually as cost effective, if not better, than a public cloud, right? The challenge is many people don't actually go to the trouble of doing that. It's a much easier process for them to just consume from the public cloud on demand as needed. So that's sort of one end of the spectrum. Then you have players where you have people who built out their private clouds, and then there's pockets within their organizations that are using public cloud and starting to actually develop applications natively in the public cloud. Sometimes it's developer workloads, or sometimes it's just new applications done from scratch. And so they're in that stage of the game. And then there are, the other extreme, smaller companies for the most part, and are betting increasingly on the public cloud, right? They don't build out a private cloud, and they're just focused on running their business entirely on the public cloud. Mm-hmm. So you got that extreme. And then in the middle, you have categories of where IT is trying to play a relevant role in helping this migration to public cloud. And I would say that vast majority of enterprises are going to go, at least in some form or fashion, to the public cloud. May not be fully. It'll take a long time for that to happen, if it happens. But they're always going to have, everybody that I talk to is interested. If not already, they're moving. So a company like VMware, for example, recognizes that. And we've articulated the fact that multi-cloud, hybrid cloud is very much a key part of our vision going forward. And the ability to provide, essentially, it's regardless of where a workload is run, securing it, providing visibility, migrating workloads, providing all the services that on top of what I would imagine is a basic hypervisor platform. That's really where the value add is.
So seems like, from what you're saying, right, from a VMware perspective, you are providing solutions where customers embracing VMware-based private clouds, and then they could be using somebody else's public clouds, and you will have solutions associated with that. And that's where this network virtualization actually plays even a bigger role.
Yes, I mean, for example, earlier this year we announced a partnership with IBM in SoftLayer, where they're going to be deploying a VMware public cloud. Yeah. Using our stack, off-prem, so customers can go consume it, whether on-prem or off-prem. Yeah. And they can choose, mix and match, and they can choose, and it's kind of a similar experience. Yeah.
So would that be a better advantage to the customers where they run both their private cloud and public cloud in the same environment versus private cloud in your environment and public cloud in an AWS environment?
I think you're going to see both. Right, so there'll be a class of applications that
but what about from an application performance, security, and other perspective?
There's no doubt, right? I mean, we actually think it'll be a lot easier if you run everything on the same environment, right, and you get a very consistent experience, performance, security, visibility. And that's why we're enabling things like, running a VMware stack on IBM and you making that available to customers, right? So very similar. But that will not be the only game in town, right? People are increasingly developing applications natively for public cloud environments using, services that are provided uniquely by AWS. And now, the one catch with all that is there's a lot of lock-in. When that happens, you're fairly locked into that particular public cloud provider, and you're no longer really able to migrate from there. But nevertheless, there's a lot of development happening, and so we also feel like there is going to be that mixed environment out there. It's not going to be all, on one stack across the whole universe, which, of course, it'd be great if that's the case for us. And so we have to handle both kinds of environments.
So do you see, if you segment the market, right, do you see like Global 2000, Fortune 500, adapting the public cloud, or even if they don't, then the legacy applications or the company proprietary applications, do you see these applications moving to the public cloud? Because there were some remarks earlier on this podium, right, where people were actually betting on the fact that at the end of the day, most of these applications will eventually run on public cloud. So what's your thought?
I mean, obviously, it's much easier to start new in the public cloud, right? So taking an existing application, running it in the public cloud is probably more pain. And there'll be a class of people who do it. So do I have a definitive opinion on what's going to happen here? I don't know. And I think the views would differ widely. I don't think you can categorically say what exactly is going to happen. For sure, new workloads, a lot easier to go run that on a public cloud. Legacy workloads that you're running locally, you may or may not want to take the pains to go migrate it.
So there's some questions that are coming up, especially related to these containers. Right now, that seems to be the next phase. And what is the network virtualization function when people start deploying these containers?
I think almost exactly the same, right? Whether you deploy VMs or whether you deploy containers, you still need to provide connectivity between them. You still need to provide scalability of workloads and location independence across whether it's containers or whether it's VMs. You still need to secure at a per container level now, right, as opposed to a per VM level. So effectively, from a network virtualization perspective, for us, it's essentially the same. Now, you need bigger scale in terms of the number of entities you're going to deal with. So it's becomes more of a scaling issue than anything else. But functionally, it doesn't change much for us.
I see.
Hi, I'm Shija Dhoni, and I'm currently a student at Berkeley. But I'm actually been the vice president at American Express for Japan, Asia Pacific. So that's my background. This is on NSX. Two questions. So one is, what do you think about NSX in the roadmap of SDN? Where, do you think it's truly SDN the way it is defined? And part two, from what I see and understand of NSX, it seems to me it's a good starting point to start, consolidating a data center. I know people talk a lot more about server virtualization, but in reality, if you can get the network virtualized, you can actually make the subsequent layers much more easy to transport. Could you validate these two questions?
Yeah, we should hire you as a VMware salesperson. So anyway, I think both the points you made are very valid. First of all, SDN, software-defined networking, can mean many different things to many different people. So we like to talk specifically about network virtualization. And if you look at kind of the amount of deployment that's happened, I would say the vast majority of the money spent to date has actually been on network virtualization. We talked about how our business is on a $600 million run rate exiting last year, and then it doubled, year over year the first quarter. So it's actually real business and it's growing. And so if you look at this whole universe of SDN, I think this is by and large the most real component. There's a lot of other elements to SDN, right? There's, people look at white boxes and separate network operating systems as part of SDN as well. They look at analytics applications. So there's a lot of other things that are being lumped into SDN as well. But this particular thing is a very clear-cut segment that's growing very well. And to your second question about enabling data center consolidation. I think that this has been a two-phased effort for many people, which is the first phase has been compute virtualization, which helps you up the utilization from maybe from 10 to 30% or whatever. And then on top of that, you do network virtualization. I think to quote James Hamilton from Amazon, I think many years ago he said, AWS, he's the chief architect at AWS, and he said, look, I spent 10% of my CapEx on networking, but it gets in the way, right? The network is in the way of enabling me to utilize the other 90% of the CapEx spend that I make in my infrastructure. Therefore, the network is very, very critical, and I need to make sure that it doesn't become a blocker in what I do. And that's really where network virtualization plays, because your spend on it is maybe 10% of, or less of what you spend in the data center, but you need that to create the level of automation and free up the ability to use any resource anywhere in the data center.
Yeah, hi. My name is Deep, and I work for Cisco. So the question I have is that shall we run container in a VM?
Say that again, sorry?
Can we run containers in a VM?
Oh yeah, many of the initial deployments are actually containers running on top of VM, yes.
But how do we get the agility and the other part of containers which otherwise will lose because of the VM?
Again, I think this is more of a hierarchical nesting approach, right? You can run containers natively, you can run containers on a VM, and those are choices you make, and you can still get agility. You can use vMotion to, for example, move the entire VM over, and all the containers would move over, for example.
Shailesh here, I'm from Citrix. I have a question on what's your perspective on where the virtual ADC market is heading in the years to come?
I think, so you're talking about the virtual application delivery controllers or virtual load balancing. I think that market will continue to grow. In fact, Jagdish is probably well qualified to answer that question. He's the father of Citrix load balancing. So I actually think that there's been a lot of talk about it. So we like to think of it as north-south load balancing and east-west load balancing. And in fact, today, even in NSX, we actually have east-west load balancing as part of our platform, and fairly simple. And I do think that, look, there's always going to be a big box load balancer deployed kind of at the periphery. But more and more functions can actually be done by virtual load balancers. Jagdish, you want to talk about it?
No, I think definitely the virtual load balancing, as the number of applications and number of virtualized elements start to increase, right? You must have a load balancing that helps to balance the load as well as to ensure, right, stability in the environment and all that stuff. I mean, that's the big opportunity. There is a bunch of startup companies that have been funded in that area. And I think as this microsegmentation, right, starts to take off, you will see proliferation of these virtual load balancers.
Hello, Arun from Platform 9. Since we've been talking about containers now, one question that I had was, with containers proliferating now, do you see innovative change in networking required, or do you think the networking that we have today with network function virtualization continue to support the scale and whatever we do with network containers?
Yeah, so look, I mean, at the end of the day, what we're doing in network virtualization is actually building a very large-scale distributed system. Mm-hmm. That's really what it is. Mm-hmm. And it's a fairly complex endeavor, mm-hmm. right? And getting the scale that you need is actually one of our constant challenges in what we do, because everything has to scale, right? All the various parameters, and adding containers to that list just means you got lots more of them, and it doesn't mean more bandwidth or anything. It's not about bandwidth, but it's the number of endpoints, and you have a lot more endpoints, and therefore you have to scale appropriately. And so that, to a large extent, depends on how well you architected the implementation of it. So if you do it right, then you should be able to scale. That is probably the single biggest challenge I see.
Yeah, so related to that, right? Debugging, as you start to scale this entire, in a virtualized environment, right? As you start this network virtualizations, obviously you will start seeing a lot bigger virtualized environment across multiple data centers. So debugging should be addressed, and that probably is an opportunity for many entrepreneurs as well.
I mean, the one thing I want to say here, right? The way to think about this is it's a platform, right? Mm. And it's a platform that depends also on a very broad ecosystem of support around it. In fact, today we partner with hardware switch vendors, we partner with services vendors such as firewall players and load balancing players, and there's a broad ecosystem of other partners for example, that provide visibility, instrumentation, analytics, data collection, and big data analytics on top of these platforms. So the way we can be successful here, and this is also an opportunity for a lot of startups who can partner with folks like us, is to sort of look at this as a very broad-based ecosystem. You have a platform, the platform has a lot of extensions, endpoint security, for example. What you do with it, right, and picking off special parts of it and being best in class in that, and we have a broad ecosystem partner program, and working with us, I think, is not a bad strategy.
Yeah. Even from a security standpoint, I mean, you already have like Palo Alto Networks and others who can plug in their modules into your environment. Right?
Yes, and we have a very good integration with folks like Palo Alto, where we actually do service chaining, and we are able to look at traffic and figure out what traffic gets routed to Palo Alto or other firewall providers for them to go access. Similarly, we have partnerships with endpoint service security providers. So there's a broad, like I said, broad ecosystem. There's an opportunity to provide, like on top of this platform like this, how do you get visibility? How do you assess what's going on in the data center? So all of that is opportunity. And we can't do everything ourselves.
Next question. I think we have time for maybe one more question.
Yeah, hi, BV and Rajiv. Nice to meet you. My name is Bruce Feeney, and I work at Zentera. So I have a two-part question. You've got my interest. I heard you mention something about legacy applications, perhaps that are tied to static IP addresses. So I'd like to know if you have any plans for how to deal with forwarding those IP addresses into, for example, SoftLayer. And then the other thing that was very interesting is that you've taken your cross-domain SDN capability, and I guess you're working with SoftLayer, as you talked a little bit earlier, leveraging the VMware stack. Are you planning on having some broader capability like that with the more well-known clouds like AWS, Azure, Rackspace? Those are my questions.
Our intent over time is to have our stack as broadly deployed as possible everywhere, right? That's what we've talked about IBM. And yeah, we'll keep you posted as we talk about other people over time. But really, I think our goal is to get the stack to run everywhere. In terms of migration of IP addresses, yeah, sure. Let's have an offline chat about that. That's doable.
Okay, super. I'll do that. Thank you.
Hi, Rajiv and Jagdish. My name is Sanjay Dar. Just a basic question I have about the SDN market. There is generally a lot of confusion about what are the various constituents of the SDN market. You talk about network virtualization, there's NFV, VNFs, and a whole lot of more. I mean, there's the traditional network management and so on and so forth. I would like to understand from your perspective, what is the size of the market and what do you really consider is part of that SDN market? And second is, how do you see the trajectory going forward in the next 5 years? Everybody is talking about a huge growth curve on the SDN. What's your perspective? I know VMware NSX is doing well, but maybe you may not be able to share the internal trajectory, but in general, as an industry, what's the adoption at the moment, and how do you see that growing?
Yeah, so there's many different components of SDN, right? And and depending on who you talk to, you might get a different answer. I'll give you my perspective. One aspect when people think of SDN, they talk about just standalone software operating systems, okay, for network operating systems. Like, for example, Cumulus Networks plays there as an example. But, any networking provider has their OS. Cisco has an XOS, Juno has Juniper, Arista has EOS. And so today, a lot of that is bundled sales, right? So yeah, you can call it SDN. We have a modern operating system running on top of hardware. It gets sold bundled. Is that SDN? Yeah, I don't know, right? I mean, it's now there are companies, pure plays like Cumulus, who would pretty much just sell the software. They don't necessarily sell the hardware. So that's one element of the market. And if you want to call it the entire switching market, that's $20 billion, okay? That includes both hardware and software. So how do you break that apart? It's hard to tease that apart. I mean, there's not a big market for standalone networking operating systems today. Then there's SDN controllers. So now again, every networking vendor typically has an SDN controller for controlling their network, the physical network, I should say. And sometimes that extends up into the virtual network as well. Cisco has, for example, ACI, application control infrastructure. So that's another component of SDN. Then there's sort of analytics type applications, right? There's big switches, for example, Big Tap, where you punt the traffic over and you monitor it, and you can call that an SDN application. Then we have network virtualization, which is what we do. And that is really creating a virtual layer that sits on top of the hypervisor. So it's sort of hard to pinpoint and come up with specific numbers for each of these things. I would say by far, if you look at it from a revenue perspective or in terms of the size of the market, the biggest immediate market that I see is just network virtualization, because it's a very clear use case. People are paying for it. We are monetizing it. $600 million run rate is not insignificant for a software, pure software business. And that's growing, right? I mean, I think there's a very simple, if I look at it for VMware, for example, there's a huge VMware install base out there. And then on top of that, there is a whole growing KVM install base as well, right? And our goal is we can run high network virtualization on top of both of those. And it also will play a role in terms of bridging between private and public cloud. So the market is huge, potentially, right? Multiple billions.
No, I think this would be more an enabler to make the market much bigger.
That's right. And then you start looking at the ecosystem around all of this. I mean, that's a whole different market, right? There's a whole big security ecosystem. How much of that comes in? A virtual load balancer, is that part of SDN? Probably is, and that's load balancing today is a couple of $1 billion market, right? So a good chunk of that could move virtual over time. So it's a very, if you look at the overall market opportunity, it's pretty big.
Yeah. So Rajiv, I think as closing remark, what would be your advice to the entrepreneurs as well as to the industry?
So I think for the entrepreneurs, there's an opportunity here. This, like I said, I think we're still early in the game in terms of this whole software-defined movement and getting data centers automated and moving to public cloud. And so there's a lot of piece parts and piece elements that you can do. Trying to build a full platform play as a startup is not that easy, but focusing on a specific area and being best in class to complement platforms that are out there like ours, I think is a good strategy. For the industry, I think, this migration is happening, right? Public to private cloud, private to public cloud is happening, and I think the industry needs to figure out how to enable that, how to make CIOs successful in terms of helping their companies make this transition, because it's a complex thing for most CIOs to tackle. Mm-hmm. I mean, they lose visibility, they lose compliance, they're all challenged with figuring out how to make their environments more efficient. Mm-hmm. And none of this is that simple, right? Building an efficient private cloud is complex. Going to the public cloud, while it may seem easy on a one-off basis, but for an enterprise overall looking at it, it's not easy. Mm-hmm. So making this transition happen, I think is a good opportunity for all of us. Mm-hmm.
It'll be wonderful to have you back at TiE in different forms, because TiE, as you know, works very closely with entrepreneurship, and your background, your experience, and your mentorship, I think, would be very valuable to many of the entrepreneurs. So we would love to have you back again.
Thank you, Jagdish. I'm glad to be here. Thank you again.
Thank you.